Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and we're recording this on April 8th, 2025. And the working title for today's show is Why the Industrial Emitters Carbon Tax is Critical to Canada's Economy. Look, I know there are probably not probably not a topic more boring than carbon pricing. And, the fact that we had a big fight in Canada over the consumer's carbon tax, the politics made it interesting. The tax itself, not so much. And as of April 1st, the federal program is done. Most of the provinces, not all of them, have followed and canceled their version of if they had a provincial version of the consumer's carbon tax. But you know what? The emissions covered by the consumer's carbon tax can be covered by other things: rebates, regulations, subsidies. There's all sorts of other tools. And the economists generally think of emissions in four categories. So power, which is electricity, transportation, industry, and buildings. So the power sector and the transportation sector, well on our way to decarbonizing those. We got renewables and batteries and all sorts of things in power, hydro and nuclear. And on the transportation side, we're electrifying transportation in a big way and in a hurry, thanks to China. But industry and buildings are much tougher, and that, especially when it comes to industry, that's where the industrial carbon tax plays a role. Now, if you paying attention to what we do, and maybe you've been a reader and a listener for many years, you'll know that we don't talk about climate change, because as soon as you get into a discussion of climate change, then it becomes a moral argument. It's about, well, I don't believe in the science, or I think energy poverty and energy security are more important than climate change, that kind of an argument. We don't want to go there. We have demonstrated over and over again in our energy transition theory of change that the real driver behind clean energy technologies and ready to push out fossil fuels out of the global market is economic. It's technology change, which then disrupts industries and business models, and it becomes an economic reason. It's cheaper, it's more efficient. That's why you switch over to like an EV or a heat pump. Okay, so that's that. But there is an economic argument on the industrial carbon tax side. And that just completely gets ignored. We hardly ever talk about it. I've been covering this for probably back to 2016, 2017. But at the national level, we don't talk about it at all. Why is it important? Because the Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada, over the last couple of years, they've had the Axe the Tax campaign, and they've raised public opposition against the consumer tax. And it was last week or the week before, Poilievre came out and said, now we want to eliminate the industrial emitters carbon tax, which is kind of ironic, because the last couple of elections, they said, yes, get rid of the consumer's tax, but they said, no, keep the industrial emitters carbon tax. That's really important. Why did they change their mind? Because on March 19th, 14 oil and gas CEOs sent a letter, and one of the things that they demanded was that the industrial emitters carbon tax be handed back, complete authority, over to the provinces. And if you want to kill a carbon tax in Alberta, which is the source of most of these emissions, give it to Premier Danielle Smith. Give her authority over it, and it's done. So here's what they said. Quote, we want to attract investment. The federal carbon levy on large emitters is not globally cost competitive and should be repealed to allow provincial governments to set more suitable carbon regulations. I'm going to debunk that in the course of this video. So you just buckle up, buttercups, because this is interesting. This is more of the regressive kind of thinking that we've seen over the last, certainly since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So what I want to do, first of all, is this book. I wrote this book in 2019. It's called The New Alberta Advantage: Technology, Policy, and the Future of the Oil Sands. And the reason I wrote it is because I spent 2016, 2017, 2018 interviewing people in the oil and gas industry, interviewing economists, interviewing all sorts of experts on in the oil and gas emissions in Alberta. And one of them was Dave Collier, he's an engineer, a lovely guy, used to be the CEO of Shell Canada. And then he went over and he was the CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers from 2008 to 2014. He gave me many interviews and lots of his insights into what was going on in the industry. And he said that even as far back as 2008, the industry was holding seminars and, getting its head around this climate science and realizing that it had to do something. Okay. So then I interviewed a fellow named Harbir China, another engineer. He's the VP of technology at Cenovus. And Cenovus in the oil sands, because as I've said many times, it's like peanut butter, right? So bitumen is like peanut butter. It's very thick. It's got sand in it, and hydrocarbons are trapped in there. And so you have to either mine it, which is about half the 3.3 million barrels a day of production, or you use steam-assisted gravity drainage. And what you do there is you drill a couple of well bores down into the resource, and one of them has steam, and it kind of melts makes the bitumen flow, and then the other well bore collects the now viscous crude oil, and you pump it up to the surface. Problem is that you have to burn a lot of natural gas or petcoke in order to make that steam, and that's why the oil sands emissions are so high. How high are they, you ask? I'm glad you'd ask that question, because they were 89 kilograms of CO2e equivalent per barrel in 2009. They've now fallen to an average of 66 kilograms of CO2e per barrel. But you have to understand that there's a lot of variation in there, because there's I think 22 projects up north, and not all of them are created equal. Some of them are older and less efficient, and some of them have more carbon intense bitumen than others in their resource. So on the low end, you could go down as low as 37 kilograms. Now that is getting very close to the North American average, the U.S. average, sorry, which is 31 kilograms. Okay, so not quite low, but it's getting down. It's getting down there. On the other end of the scale, some of those projects are 120 to 140 kilograms of CO2e. That's some of the dirty. If that isn't the dirtiest oil on the planet, it's right up there with them. And so this is the problem. Is you've got a big variation in industrial emitters. Some are a real problem, and some of them are much less of a problem, but it's still a problem. And so on the SAG-D side, what Harbir China told me, he says, look, we're working on this solvent substitution. So instead of using steam, or maybe even using a lot less steam, like 50% or 75% of less steam, you use this solvent, which is a light hydrocarbon. We used to call it Varsol back in the day when we had a barrel of it in the auto shop at high school. And you'd use it to clean your hands and clean parts and stuff like that. So it's very light kind of fluid, hydrocarbon. Anyway, so what you do is you pump that in there, and instead of melting it, you kind of dissolve it. That's what you use to make it flow, so that you can get it into your wellbore and get it up to the surface. And they had done all sorts of experiments for years, figuring out at what pressures and what concentrations and what kind of resource. It's the way engineers work, right? That's what we want them to work, is that they should experiment, they should test, and they should figure out what works. Okay. And he said, and here's a phrase that you're going to hear a lot of in this video. He said over and over and over again, he said, Markham, we know that climate is going to be increasingly important out to 2050. And we know that there are going to be climate policies that penalize oil with high emissions intensity, lots of emissions, like oil sands, ultra sour heavy crude, and will pay a premium for lower emissions intensity. Like Norway's got a field, Johan Sverdrup. It's like 1/10 of 1%, or 1/10 of 1 kilogram of CO2e. So it's like almost nothing, right? So that you would pay a premium for Johan Sverdrup oil. You would pay. There would be a penalty and a higher cost for oil sands bitumen. That's the future that he was describing, and he said the industry subscribed to that. They all accepted that was the case. Dave Collier agreed that was the case. And I interviewed lots of others who were in that camp. Now, I want to tell you a story, and uh, you may be skeptical when you hear this. I get it. I've had lots of people in the industry push back and say that never happened. You're making it up. Well, no, because you know why? What journalists do is they go on, they interview people like Arlene Strom, who is literally Suncor's legal counsel, the head lawyer. She is not going to be telling falsehoods in an on-the-record interview. I record it, and she agrees that she will let her name stand behind it. That's the gold standard of verification for a journalist. And I had tons of those kinds of interviews when I was doing these stories. But here's the story. So in 2014, a number of the oil sands CEOs came to Dave Collier and they said, Dave, we've got this tar sands campaign, and that's a grist for a whole nother story, believe me. And I've done a lot of work, but tar sands campaign, anti-oil sands campaign, right? It's ruining our brand globally. It's just a horrible pain for us. We want peace in the valley. Will you please convene 5 environmental groups and their executive directors, and we'll provide 5 oil sands CEOs, and let's see if we can sit down and thrash something out to get peace in the valley. So in September of 2014, all of these groups met at an Italian restaurant in Calgary. And on the oil sands CEO side, Dave Collier was the co-chair. And on the ENGO side, the environmental groups, it was Zipporah Berman, who was later demonized in Alberta for her stand, but at that time was seen as a kind of a reasonable middle ground environmentalist. Now, here's what's interesting. Over the course of the winter, they had many, many meetings. And people I talked to who were in those meetings said, look, when we sat down, and Ed Whittingham, who was the executive director of Pembina Institute at the time, he said, when they walked in the door, we were sure they were going to have, horns and a tail. They were the devil. And what happened is once they got around the table and they shared a meal and had a glass of wine and talked, they found they had a lot more in common than they thought. And the environmental groups were not nearly as intransigent and difficult to deal with as the CEOs thought. And the environmentalists learned that the CEOs were actually not bad people and were concerned about this issue and thought that indeed something should be done. So when the springtime rolled around, they had entered into a handshake agreement, 5 CEOs, 5 executive directors. And some of the things they agreed on were 100 megaton a year emissions cap on the oil sands industry. Now, this was the NDP were in power roughly around that time. Rachel Notley formed government and brought in the Climate Action Plan in November. More about that in a minute. And she had commissioned or asked economics professor Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta, highly respected, and he went around and consulted, and he came back and provided a report, and he said, and a lot of it was was the basis for the Climate Action Plan. The thing that wasn't in it, the 100 megaton oil sands emissions cap, because that came from the oil sands CEOs and the executive directors of the environmental groups. But they had some stuff that overlapped. So the oil sands CEO said, yes, we will agree to carbon pricing. And yes, we will agree to 45% reduction in methane emissions. And there were a few other things. But for our story's purpose, that's enough. So they agreed to carbon pricing because they know they need to be carbon cost and carbon competitive. Now, what kind of future do they foresee? Well, it's already happening. You see the European Union, I think it's in a year or two, they're going to begin implementing it, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So they're going to know the emissions intensity of the goods that they import. And if it has a higher than, a threshold emissions intensity, there will be some kind of a carbon price applied to it. So if you were to ship, a high emissions barrel of bitumen over to Europe, then it would cost more and it would not be competitive with oil that came from someplace like Norway, the example I used. That's the future that the oil sands CEOs really truly believed was on the way. And so if you could cut your cost per barrel to produce the oil and cut your emissions per barrel so that you weren't, you were either at or below your competitors, then you could be competitive way out to 2050, even, given the modeling for oil demand that we had at that time. They were motivated. Didn't have to come to this at the barrel of a gun. And I asked Harbir, I said, why do you need government to do it? If it's such good business, why don't you do it? He said, we're all competitors. He said, there is no way that if we did it today and the other companies weren't doing it, our shareholders would hold us an emergency meeting, fire the board, and there'd be a new CEO the next day. And so he said, we need government to do this. It has to be regulated by government. We accept that. And so that was their motivation. And so in the fall of that year, September, the group of CEOs and executive directors, they sat in the fifth floor office of the Alberta legislature in Edmonton, in the office of the environment minister at that time, Shannon Phillips. And I interviewed Shannon, I think, about three times for this. And she recalled in the first one, she recalled the meeting as she was, she's sort of looking at these people over at desk, and she hears this story and what the CEOs agreed it to, and she looked at them and she went, "You agreed to that?" And then they explained why, and she went, "Oh, all right, well that makes perfect sense." And so she took those recommendations back to the premier, and it went into the climate action plan, which was released in November. And there's a very famous photo. I think it was in the Herald, Calgary Herald newspaper, but it's four oil sands CEOs standing behind the premier as she announces the climate action plan. And everybody went, "Why would they do that?" Well, because they had reached a handshake deal with the environmental groups, and they were there to support the climate action plan because it was essentially the regulations that they had been asking for. You can understand why there are some Albertans whose head exploded when I told that story, and you can see it. I published it in 2018 after all the interviews I did, and I'm sure there are still many people in the oil and gas industry in Calgary who refuse to believe that. I stand by my reporting. And in fact, Suncor has a magazine on their website. I don't know if you can find it now, but it was from 2016, and it was their internal magazine, and it featured an interview with a joint interview with Arlene Strom and Ed Whittingham, and they talked about the very things that I just mentioned to you. They described it. So it's really on the record. It's not, you don't have to trust me. It's there in that magazine if you want to go check it out. Well, so that is the economic argument that emissions are going to be priced for in barrels of oil in the coming future. Now, here's the thing. Well, a lot of what I know about the oil sands emissions comes from energy economist Kevin Byrne, and I've been interviewing him for probably 10 years anyway about this topic. And over that time, he became the global leader of S&P's Global's emissions team, emission measurement team. I said, well, why do you have an emissions measurement team? He said, we can already see the global market trying to price emissions in crude oil. He said, it's hard. We don't really know, nobody wants to buy. We buy on price and grade. Emissions intensity is a hard thing to people get their heads around. He said, but that we're convinced that that's where it's going. And so we have a team of economists who can verify the data and come up with reasonable numbers for emissions intensity. And that's important if you're going to attach a premium or a penalty to it. Okay, so this is the future. That is the economic argument for the industrial emitters carbon tax. Now, I want to talk to you about and explain what the emissions are. Now, there is every year, the Environment and Climate Change Canada puts out the National Inventory Report. And you can go there and you can, it's a little report on the latest where Canada's emissions are, greenhouse gas emissions are at. And they're 2 years behind. So the latest is 2022. And you can download right off the website a spreadsheet with you can get one for the entire Canada, entirety of Canada, broken down by the industries and their sub industries, and then you can get one same way for each province. And I've got both, and I've been through them extensively. And here's what I can tell you: Canadian emissions, 31% comes from the oil and gas industry. And the oil sands, all by itself, is 11 or 12% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. The next one is heavy industry, and that would be like steel making and cement making, that kind of thing. And then you have the power sector, electricity. Now, only makes up 6.6% of emissions because Canada has one of the cleanest grids in the entire world. It's about 84% clean, 60% hydro, 17% nuclear, and the rest would be wind and solar and whatever else we've got. So uh, all of those together are like 49, 50% of all of our emissions. So if you're going to get rid of the consumer's carbon tax, but you have alternatives, more expensive, because I accept the argument that the economists make that carbon pricing is the most effective, elegant, lowest cost way to lower emissions. But I've interviewed economists as well about this, and they will tell you that in order to have a carbon tax, you have to have political support for it. And let's face it, the Trudeau Liberals did not build the political support, the political constituency that they needed to support their own policy. That's a problem. So if you haven't got it and you can't build it, move on. Go do something else that's maybe a little more costly, but gets the job done. On the industrial side, however, it's an entirely different story. And up until now, the industry has been supportive of it. Uh, but that's obviously changing. But if we're going to have a competitive economy going forward, we need to grapple with this issue, and the industrial emitters carbon tax is the best way. Now, here are some of the things that are a problem. So the oil sands companies are complaining that the 14 oil and gas CEOs saying, "Oh my God, we're not carbon competitive at the international level." Well, nobody else has a carbon tax on oil and gas, at least not that I'm aware. And so, of course, they're not competitive because they have this additional cost, which is supposed to help them decarbonize. How big is the cost, you ask? Excellent question. I have an answer, at least partly an answer. In Suncor's 2024 investor presentation, which I think they do in May of every year, they tell investors what they pay. And in 2020, the year previous, they had paid 47 cents per barrel on every barrel they produced. 47 cents. And this is a time when prices are up around $80. Then they're paying 47 cents. I mean, it's a pittance. Then they projected out 10 years to 2034, and they said it's going to cost us $1.70 a barrel. $1.70 a barrel. Again, if it's what's just above a pittance, $1.70 a barrel. That's what. So the cost to them is very, very low, even though when they were doing the calculations for 2023, it was like the carbon price was like $60, and then it went up $15 to 85 cents per ton. Okay, so it's getting up there, and it would have gone up to $170 by 2030. But even at that, Suncor says, nope, it's only $1.70 per barrel. What's going on here? Well, let me tell you. I interviewed Dave Sawyer from Enviroeconomics, and he's done a lot of work. Now, if you need to, you can go read on Energy Talks on the podcast. You can go and listen to the interview. And if you ever need to be put to sleep at night, when you're having trouble going to sleep, listen to an economist talk about carbon pricing. Guaranteed to knock you out. And I don't say that as a slur against economists like Dave. It's really complicated. It's really complex. It's hard to understand. But here's what he explained to me. He said, to make the carbon price work, they have a carbon market which means that the government issues a number of free credits, and then on top of that, the if you're a low emissions producer, you get credits, and if you're a high emissions producer, you can buy credits instead of paying the hundred and $85 a ton carbon price. Okay, here's the problem. When you if you have too many credits in the market, supply and demand, then the price drops. And instead of paying the $65 a barrel or per ton, Dave says the cost today is $27 a ton, which is nothing. That's why Suncor is paying $47 or 47 cents per barrel. And the market is not being properly managed. So this is a way for Alberta, and I'm not, I'm assuming that it's done deliberately because these are smart people in Edmonton. They know how the market works and they know that there's a surplus of credits and they could fix it if they wanted to. They clearly don't want to. So let's assume that it's deliberate. This is how you dilute the impact, the effect of a carbon price on oil and gas companies. You play with the rules. You issue more credits than should be in the market, and then they pay lower costs, and they still want it eliminated. Why? Why? If it's a small cost, who cares? Well, I'll give you two explanations. There's probably others, but I'll give you two. For over the last 10 years, the oil and gas sector globally has not had a return on investment that kept up with other sectors like tech. In fact, it's underperformed. So lately, in the last 2, 3 years, there's been intense pressure on companies to return free cash flow to the investors as much as 75 to 100% of it. So you're not going to go out and invest in expanding. You're going to pay your investors to keep them happy, keep your stock price up. The other thing you do is you have share buybacks. So you want to keep your stock price up. You have fewer, you buy your shares back, and fewer in the market, price stays up. So investors are demanding high returns, and the companies really have no choice but to listen to the shareholders. Here's the other thing, and this comes out of OPEC. I refer to this often because it's almost like the Bible for Alberta. Nobody ever reads it, but the narratives that come out of it, they all know it. They just don't know where it comes from. It comes from OPEC. World Oil Outlook 2045 and 2050 are the two latest ones. And a key assumption of OPEC's modeling is that at the global level, the pressure to increase the severity of climate policies is abating. What OPEC argues is that taxpayers are tired of paying the higher costs of climate policies, and they're putting pressure on their governments to either get rid of them altogether or to dilute them so that they're cost less for the consumers. And there's some evidence for that. I mean, Germany has reduced some of its policies and so on. Okay. Will that? Oh, and by the way, of course, we know that Donald Trump in the United States has taken America out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So the OPEC argues that the trend is now in the opposite direction to what it was 2, 3 years ago. And the oil companies are kind of hopping on the bandwagon saying, well, if oil companies in other jurisdictions don't have to pay this carbon price, why should we? That's essentially the argument. They've abandoned the whole idea of somewhere down the road where they have to be cost and carbon competitive. You never hear that phrase anymore. At least I don't. So the argument here is, first of all, we have to keep our industries competitive. And I should point out that before the Biden administration was defeated, the Democrat lost the election in November to Trump. They had struck a committee, and they were going to start penalizing. They don't call it a tax. They were going to penalize imports with high carbon levels. So if you had a high emissions intensity in your plastic, in your steel, in your oil, your gas, whatever, you were going to be penalized by the government. Now, we're not going to have that when while Trump is in power, but maybe in 4 years from now, there's another president, another administration that goes back to that idea. But the trend, I would argue, the trend is still in favor of ever stricter climate policies. There's lots of governments that are still implementing climate policies, even if it's a little slower than they were doing before. All of which is to say that we have the oil sands companies themselves advanced a perfectly good argument for keeping the industrial emitters carbon tax. So their products are cost and carbon competitive. And, if we sold into Europe, and this is a big argument right now in Alberta. Oh my God, we need pipelines, so we want to get into Europe and Asia. Okay. So we know Europe's putting up the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and there's talk in other countries of putting up some kind of carbon pricing to tax carbon intensive imports. Seems your own argument. You want to be carbon competitive, keep the carbon tax. We figure out something on the consumer side, but ultimately, as we go and move into this brave new world where we need lower emissions intensity, this is going to be it's an economic advantage for Canada to retain it.